Everyone has heard that there is an urgent need for action to confront the climate crisis, but solutions, well, they're harder to come by. Can technology ride to the rescue? Let's find out from some people working at the forefront of those efforts, and we'll introduce them, as is our custom, from furthest away to closest to our studio, starting in Los Angeles, California, with Marcius Extavour. He's Vice President, Energy and Climate at XPrize, a global nonprofit that spurs innovation through competition for some very lucrative prizes. In Cambridge, Massachusetts, David Keith, Professor of Applied Physics in the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences and a Professor of Public Policy in the Harvard Kennedy School. He also co-hosts the podcast Energy versus Climate. And in Buffalo, New York, Holly Buck, Professor in the University of Buffalo's Department of Environment and Sustainability and the author of After Geoengineering, Climate, Tragedy, Repair, and Restoration. And it's great to have you three on TVO tonight for this very important and timely conversation. David, I want, if we can, just to spend a few moments with you off the top, because you had published this past week a piece in the New York Times about the necessity to accept controversial technologies in order to get a handle on the impacts of global warming. And here is an excerpt from your piece we'll start with, and then we'll come back and chat. Sheldon, if you would, let's bring this up. To cool the planet in this century, humans must either remove carbon from the air or use solar geoengineering, a temporary measure that may reduce peak temperatures, extreme storms, and other climatic changes. This is what it comes down to: carbon removal or solar geoengineering, or both. At least one of them is required to cool the planet this century. There are no other options. Okay, let's start there, David. Give us a brief account of the kinds of technologies you're talking about.
Yeah, but first of all, I need to push back. I did not say they were necessary, and I don't believe it. It might not be the right choice to cool the planet. The central issue is political force to drive out the existing fossil fuel infrastructure and to drive emissions down. That is the number one job. And a reasonable public policy would be to do nothing more than that in local adaptation. I think it's worth taking seriously the idea that we might want to actually make the planet cooler, because eliminating emissions doesn't make the planet cooler, it just stops it getting warmer. But I don't think it's my place to say that it's necessary, and I don't believe it's necessary.
But do you think we should have the debate?
I think we should know more about what the benefits and costs are of these things so that people can have more informed discussions about the public policy. And I wrote that piece because I'm concerned that there's a level of overhype around carbon removal, overhype that I think in different ways both the other guests are involved in. And I think it's really important to be clear-eyed about the way it's being exploited by those in power to distract from emissions cuts.
Well, all right. For those watching right now who, when you say to them geoengineering, start scratching their head because they don't quite know what that means, can you give us a sense of what you're talking about?
So it's a contested term, but for me, solar geoengineering means different ways that humans might deliberately intervene or alter the Earth's energy balance, the way the climate works, with the goal of reducing some of the climate harms that come from the accumulated carbon in the atmosphere.
And why, in your judgment, are they so controversial as an idea at the moment?
I think that there are many reasons, but I think the underlying controversy is fear of mitigation inhibition or moral hazard, which is really fear that these technologies will be used as an excuse to avoid emissions cuts.
All right. Having put all this background in place now, let me go to Holly and put to her a quote that Al Gore said 7 years ago, stating his opposition to geoengineering and calling it, quote, insane, utterly mad, and delusional in the extreme. That's Al Gore, the former vice president. Does he speak for many when he says that?
I think so. I mean, the fact that we're in a situation where we know we're warming the planet and we're causing massive extinction, it's an insane situation we're in. So I think it's also a fair assessment. I think kind of everything that's going on is insane, right? So.
All right, but having said that, from a geoengineering point of view, do you think that's an option we ought to be considering right now?
I think we need more information. So I agree with David and others, that we won't know about the potentials and the impacts and the harms and the benefits unless we do the research.
Is the research being done?
So this is where solar geoengineering and carbon removal are different. There's some limited amount of solar geoengineering research being done, but it's very early stage research. We need a lot more if we want to understand what's going on with this. Carbon removal has received more attention, but right now, like David alluded to, some of the hype and the excitement is getting ahead of the science.
Understood. All right, Marcus, is it possible that there is so much skepticism around this because so many people in the scientific world think, technology got us into this pickle in the first place, and therefore we're really not sold on the notion that technology is going to get us out of it?
Interesting question. I think it's possible some of the skepticism comes from that place. But I think there's another place too, which is we sort of at some point have to admit to ourselves, as Holly was alluding to, that the situation actually is quite dire. You could say that continuing with business as usual, avoiding emissions cuts, watching the damage that's unfolding and will continue to unfold, that is also pretty insane. And so when you sit down to map out if you sit down with a whiteboard and mapped out what the possible options would be, I think carbon removal, solar geoengineering, other things would certainly be on the table. But the question is, do we actually need to go there? Do we want to go there? How much more information do we need? But back to your question, yes, I think there's a lot of resistance to technology. I think it's right to say that our industrial economy is what got us into this place. I personally don't agree with the idea that we can unwind all of our modern economy to go back to a past that perhaps, never quite existed. We have to find a way forward. That's sort of our only choice. So it's a question of what is our path forward going to be?
And how sold are you on the notion that solar geoengineering can help get us where we need to go?
It's a totally crazy idea, but that doesn't mean we may not need it. And we're only going to figure out whether we need it and how to deploy it if that eventuality comes to pass by learning a little bit more. So I'll say that I do support the position of trying to get more information about how these techniques could work and be deployed. That doesn't mean that they're priorities, just like carbon removal. It's the kind of thing that we are increasingly forced into having to consider. That doesn't mean it's our first choice, but talking about alternative choices doesn't mean that they're necessarily job number one, and it doesn't take the focus off of emissions cuts as soon as possible.
David, how do you like that description of it's a crazy idea, but we may actually need it in the end?
I don't love it for two reasons. One is I don't really know what it means to say it's a crazy idea. It's kind of an easy thing that people say, but it's not clear to me what it actually means when I try and think about what we know about environmental risks and political risks. It has environmental risks and political risks we can talk about. And I also don't kind of like the framing of need, like we have to do it or we don't, which is coupled with this idea that there's some fixed threshold where we emit enough to keep under, say, 1.5 degrees C and we're safe, and over that we're cooked. I see this in much more kind of boring professor-ish public policy terms, that it's a decision to do this would be a trade-off between the benefits of doing it in terms of reduced harms to ecosystems and people, and the technical and physical risks of doing it, such as increased air pollution that would kill people or reduced ozone layer, and the political dynamics and instability it would create. And I think the decisions between whether or not we do solar geoengineering and how quickly we cut emissions are, in fact, less tightly coupled than people often assume.
Well, let's, if we can, pluck an example out of your life, because I think, if I've got the details on this right, you were involved in a project on this issue in Sweden, and the project got canceled because, as the New York Times reported, there were those who objected to, quote, the normalization of technology that is too dangerous. Can you fill in some of the gaps on that story?
Well, I think that's a fair statement. The Sami Council, it's an indigenous group in northern Sweden, has a pretty clear statement that says that they don't believe that technologies ever make sense. And so they don't believe research on them makes sense. And they push the Swedish government, and the Swedish government pushed to cancel the project. So that's fair. I think that I obviously don't agree. And I also think it's worth thinking hard about what authority any one group has to say that there shouldn't be more knowledge on something, particularly when the evidence evidence is pretty widely agreed in the scientific community and in the IPCC report and so on, are that these technologies could substantially help people, and particularly actually people in some of the poorer countries and hotter countries. And there's also evidence that people in poorer and hotter countries are somewhat more positive on searching these technologies. That evidence might be wrong, but I think given that, I think the Sami are perfectly legitimately can have any opinion they want. It's a perfectly reasonable opinion, but I don't think that opinion should carry the day in public policy.
And just one more quick follow-up. Who, in your judgment, is leading the charge against having more knowledge and doing more research?
I think probably the most effective group is actually originally a Canadian group called ETC. It's now headquartered outside Canada. I think for a long time they're a pretty small group, but they've been really smart and effective at critiquing that I and
What do you suspect their motives are?
You can go ask them. I really don't know. I think. Well, since you've asked me, I think there's sort of some deep disconnects. So they'll say that they want the world to kind of go back to an earlier technological era. And I sat around with the leader of that group, Canadian, over a beer one time, and pointed out that if we really did go back to kind of peasant-led agriculture, which is what they were suggesting one time, that we couldn't support the current population. A lot of billions of people would end up dying. And his reaction was more or less that that's what's going to happen anyway, so it's okay. And it's not a world that I believe in. I don't think it's an ethical view of the world, personally. I think that every life counts equally. And we really need to take seriously the fact that real humans are going to get harmed. And political ideology about some imagined perfect world should not be used in ways that will harm people.
Holly, David wrote in his piece, quote, "The science so far suggests that the harms that would result by shaving a degree off global temperatures would be small compared with the benefits." Let me ask you about trade-offs. Do you think trade-offs to get to the finish line here are inevitable?
Yes.
And how do you see that working itself out?
I mean, right now, the status quo is that we don't have a process for democratically deliberating on what those trade-offs are. And this goes for decarbonization broadly, too. I mean, thinking about, when to close natural gas plants. Do we want full electrification? Do we want green hydrogen? I mean, there's a bunch of options that require discussion of trade-offs. So it's not just solar geoengineering or carbon removal. So I think one thing that could help is if governments really took the lead on public engagement processes where citizens could deliberate about these trade-offs.
But if we go back to the story David just told, it sounds like there are certain types of climate activists for whom trade-offs are just not an option. And if that's the case, what do you do with that?
I mean, I think then it's important to have more voices in the room, because right now there's, some climate activists that are well informed about these approaches. There's a couple of other scientists, but then there's this vast empty chamber where the public should be. And most of the public has not even heard about these approaches. So maybe not well equipped, but we need to invite them in, have everybody discussing, particularly in the global south, particularly with frontline communities.
Okay, Marcus, let me ask you about Elon Musk. What is his connection to your organization?
Well, I think he's been a longtime supporter of the organization, XPrize, but specifically Musk Foundation is a benefactor behind a prize we recently launched called XPrize Carbon Removal.
And how much money has he put into your endeavor?
So it's a $100 million prize, and that came from the Musk Foundation. And the goal of the prize is to really try to start to separate fact from fiction in some of the claims made around carbon removal and encourage demonstrations of practical, tangible carbon removal demonstrations, even at modest scales.
Now, $100 million, I think, even for Elon Musk, is real money. So what does he see in the work that you are doing that he thought was so valuable to back?
It is a huge amount of money. I mean, it's one of the largest prizes we think, certainly that this organization has launched. I can't speak for him personally, but I think that from his public statements and conversations I've had, he sees carbon removal as one of several options that we may need to rely on more or less, depending on how well it actually can be shown to be effective, and depending on other choices that we make. So I think it's fair to say that he sees it as one of several options, but something worth at least pursuing further.
Now, $100 million is pretty good incentive to come up with some neat ideas. Are you, in fact, getting some interesting ideas on how to do all that?
We are. I mean, we just actually closed a student-oriented portion of the prize, which really was just a call for proposals, not demonstrations. We've got a couple hundred of those in the door. Haven't actually even had a chance to look through them before our conversation today. But more than wild new ideas, I think what the prize is going to do is try to put ideas into practice. Carbon removal has been discussed in the academic literature for some time. My fellow panelists here in the conversation are well familiar with this. What we're really hoping to do is encourage some of these techniques to actually get into small deployment so that we can collect more data, learn more about which ones actually have a future, which ones maybe don't have a future, and how the best can be optimized and taken forward.
And when will you decide on a winner?
Our timeline's about 3.5 years left, so we will be announcing milestone winners based on performance as we go, but the grand prize will be announced approximately Earth Day 2025.
And are you the decider?
I'm not the decider. I'm more of like the convener, but we have a panel of independent judges, people who work in the field, people who actually maybe don't work in the field, but who know how to look at a data set, look at a proposal, and understand whether the team has met the requirements. So the judges are independent professional volunteers.
Gotcha. I'd like David and then Holly to weigh in on what you believe to be the appropriateness or the advisability of billionaires trying to shape climate policy. David, what do you say?
I think billionaires should have less of a voice, less money and less of a voice in shaping policy. And I have real concerns about the XPrize's actions and organization on this topic. There was an earlier XPrize for carbon removal that was sponsored with COSIA, which is an organization basically designed to protect the oil stands and do some innovation while staving off regulation. And the structure of that prize was definitely, in my view, designed to help the industry in a way that didn't seem to have a very clear environmental metrics. And I really have deep concerns. And the prize for things, some kind of sharp capitalist competition for a well-defined product would actually be successful. With things that have a big ecosystem uncertainties, where I personally think the money would be much better spent by really sharply directed public research efforts, not little startups, that could, in a clear and transparent way, look at environmental impacts of some of these technologies and compare them. So I have real concerns, and I think the record for prizes in these areas actually doing useful things is pretty weak. And I have concerns both about the power of billionaires and about the structure of these prizes.
Holly, how about you?
Yeah, I think we should be taxing the billionaires and using those funds for research and development.
Yeah.
And not giving out prizes?
I mean, I think maybe that's useful from a public relations point of view to get more attention to it, but it's not going to solve the challenge is much bigger than a prize can address.
I think the challenge here is it's very hard to structure a prize that's effective when what you want to produce is a commercial technology in the real world. So I think it's different. The original XPrize was a brilliant, simple prize about 2 flights into space, which was a very measurable thing and well designed. And there have been some prizes for drugs, especially drugs for the underserved poor, that I think were well designed. But the challenge, and we saw this one earlier version of this prize called the Virgin X Prize, called the Virgin VEC Prize. The challenge with developing a prize like this is that you don't really know how technologies perform until you actually do them at commercial scale. And that's something that doesn't happen. $100 million actually isn't very much money in terms of commercial scale for these things. And it's really unclear whether the prize judging system is actually effective at getting the technologies that matter here. I think there are better ways to do it. So I'm really pretty skeptical.
Marcus, obviously I should give you an opportunity to tackle those criticisms if you want to.
Thanks, I appreciate it. I think with XPrize carbon removal, the guidelines are public, the rules are public, anyone can download and read them. With respect to the judging system, the purpose of the prize is not to solve climate. The purpose of the prize is not to generate a solution that can be deployed in 2025. The purpose of the prize is to try to distinguish between ideas that have been discussed in the literature but not really demonstrated at scale, and encourage those to try to scale even at a modest scale. It's true what David says, that it's not going to result in a commercial deployment in 3 years. That's pretty unlikely. But what we can do is actually push some of these ideas into demonstration so that the world can evaluate, but in particular the judges can evaluate whether they work or not. And with respect to evaluation, it is actually very difficult to design a good prize. I totally agree with that. What we've tried to do here is structure it around the things that matter. Can a carbon removal approach deliver a carbon negative solution? Does it actually remove CO2 from the air or oceans? And does it have a pathway to scaling to a climate relevant level, let's say the gigaton per year level? I'm not going to say that prizes are a panacea or that prizes are the only solution. And I wouldn't say that, and it'd be foolish to claim such. But I think it is fair to say a prize can have an important stimulating effect in an innovation ecosystem. It can bring a lot of players together. It can help to focus some capital, but really, I think, acts as an amplifier of existing, let's say, academic research, other granting agencies, other policy work. So I see that's one way I think prizes can work. And I'll just respond briefly to the critique of the NRG COSIA Carbon XPrize. Dave and I have spoken about this privately too. We don't have to speak about that prize in hypothetical. We can look at the results. It was awarded this spring. The two winners are from cement and concrete industry, which is probably, again, not a climate panacea, but probably one of the leading and most productive and climate relevant uses of CO2 if we're going to get there. So I'm pretty satisfied with the results, but of course, time will tell how impactful those solutions can be in the coming decades.
David, you want to come back on that?
Yeah, I do. I sat around a top office in Environment Canada a year and a half ago, where people were very excited about those little companies. And I think it was very clear that it was standing in the way of the practical ways you would actually cut CO2 emissions from cement. And I think this is a case where it's allowing government officials and the public to get kind of distracted by little shiny startups that look like they're going to do something when you avoid doing what you know you could do. So just 10 kilometers from my home in Canmore, there's a big cement plant that vents more than a million tons a year. We know how to capture from that. We know where to put it. There's no new technology needed, not some shiny object you need. You don't need a startup. Mitsubishi Heavy Industries or lots of different companies could bid on that. What's missing is government will. And my view is very up close and personal. Seeing this in the Canadian government, my view is that this kind of promise of carbon cure, which I think is very unlikely to be scalable and more expensive than that, is allowing some kind of shiny new thing to distract from actually doing the thing we know that would, in a much more cost-effective way, cut the net CO2 emissions from concrete. So I really think it's been quite disruptive.
Marcus, what, in your view, prevents these kinds of carbon removal technologies from being perhaps more widespread or more readily adopted?
They're expensive, lack of political will, and frankly, lack of market incentive. The only way to make these technologies more effective or cheaper is to actually try to develop them. That's what I think a company like Carbon Cure is doing. But, I'm sensitive to the argument David is making, which is that alternatives to the number one option can be distracting. But this is exactly what we're discussing today. We're discussing whether geoengineering or carbon removal are distractions from immediate emissions cuts. I think clearly the risk is there. David says he has upfront personal experience with it. I don't doubt that. I've been in some similar conversations as well. It's clearly and obviously a distraction because there's a strong inertia in our system to maintain the status quo. But talking about alternative solutions, we have to find a way to talk about alternative solutions and even explore them without allowing that to be a distraction for steep emissions cuts. So, to Environment Canada, I would say, shame on you for being distracted if that's the case. This is an alternative, but it's clearly not the first option. The first option is immediate emissions cuts.
Let me get Holly to weigh in on this issue of the advisability of prizes. One of the things we've seen, you can demonstrate the fact that if you give a lot of money away to authors, let's say, they're going to sell more books. We have a prize in Ontario for poetry called the Griffin Prize, and they give a lot of money away to the best poetry. And the result at the end of the day is a lot more people read poetry than might otherwise read poetry. If you take that same principle and you apply it here, is it possible you'll get more interest and focus on climate change because of this prize than you might otherwise have done?
Sure, but I think what people need to understand is that the challenge here isn't just getting the best technology. We're building social technical systems. So you have to think about carbon removal like the electricity grid or like the water system. There's a lot of pieces. It's not just about the tech, it's about the institutions, it's about the regulation, it's about the users of that system. It's about, do communities have benefits from it? So maybe a prize can help with some pieces of that, but we don't want the prize to distract from all the other pieces of it too.
All right, let me put a new issue on the table here, and that is, and we haven't talked about this yet, and it is for some, a very non-controversial option, and for others, it is a complete non-starter. David, start us off on a discussion about nuclear energy. Do we need more of it to help us get through the climate crisis?
I would like to see more nuclear power because it has a low land footprint. And so if you're going to, I think one challenge of decarbonization is that there's no question we can decarbonize without nuclear power. The absolutely stunning improvements in the cost of solar mean that the pathway to large-scale decarbonization with solar looks much more real than it did 10 years ago. And my view is there's no necessity for nuclear. But there are lots of other technologies like hydro and wind, and biomass, which have comparatively big land and environmental footprints. And I do think, especially in a cold place with big winters like Canada, if you want to think about ways that solve the climate problem, that is stop putting CO2 in the air, and also reduce other environmental harms, I think it's important to take nuclear seriously. But that said, if you ask me how to do it, how practically, like which reactor technology and what government policy and what way to communicate with the public could get to something that exactly as Holly said is a socio-technical system that makes nuclear work, I have no idea. Every element of that is broken. Public trust is broken. The companies that develop these technologies have done in some ways a terrible job. I also have just horrific experiences from being on a top panel in Canada and talking to people at the Canadian Nuclear Agency and literally, no exaggeration, being lied to. So my faith as somebody who's a physicist and pro-nuclear in AECL just went to zero in that experience. So we've got broken trust, high costs, and problems. Yet I still think there actually is some real use for developing nuclear power in a climate future, and it's a big challenge to figure out how to do it.
AECL being Atomic Energy of Canada, the once upon a time Crown Corporation. Okay, Holly, you are literally a hop and a skip and a jump away from the Ontario border, and we depend on nuclear for about half of our energy mix, maybe some days more than half of our electricity mix here in the province of Ontario. I'm not sure what it is in New York State, where you are, but is it an option, do you think, to help get us out of the climate crisis?
Yes, I do. I don't think it's perfect. I think we're out of perfect options. And I'm very concerned about, as a sociologist, about social backlash to higher prices or lack of reliable energy. We've seen some fluctuations lately, with blackouts, with gas shortages in other parts of the world. Nuclear could be a solution to that. And if we don't fix that soon, I think all of our decarbonization goals could be threatened.
Marcus, what's your take on nuclear?
Somewhat similar. The scientist in me sees that it's a low footprint, low carbon electricity source. And if our goal is looking at climate or specifically looking at greenhouse gas load, it's something we have to take seriously. But I grew up in Ontario. I live in now California, where there's discussion of closing nuclear facilities. I'm always struck at how much dissonance there is between sort of the science view of things and what the general person that I'll ask, hey, what do you think about nuclear power is? A lot of people just think it's a disastrous idea. They think it's a symbol of the worst excesses of our industrial age. I don't quite see it that way. I think it can have a future, but I sort of agree that we don't have a lot of public space to actually have that conversation, and it's possible we may not be able to navigate through that. So it's hard to say, but I think it can have a future, but it'll be pretty tricky.
Gotcha. A few minutes to go here. Let me see if I can get a couple of more items on the table. David, to you first. You recently tweeted, quote, "If I were climate czar, a job I would fail at," you add, "I would spend more than 95% of current climate effort and money on cutting emissions or adaptation resiliency." What does that actually mean in terms of the technologies you are eyeing at the moment?
So I think the big thing, I very much share Holly's view that I'm scared that we'll have an overreach and a public backlash against the cost of cutting emissions. So maybe just a few big picture things. You started this with sort of technology versus something else? I think the answer is any solution to this is always about technology and public policy. There's no version of it that doesn't. And people often talk about technology when they forget that all the methods involve technology. Solar, it's all technology. So I think the issue is really how cost effectively we drive down emissions. And I'm worried that we're now spending a lot of money on a lot of very high-priced things that look kind of sweet but don't cut emissions very effectively, like, say, public transit. And then what we'll see is after 5 years or something, a very high public concern and high government ambition about emissions cuts, we will see energy prices up and emissions not going down very fast. And so my view is we need to be more kind of cold-blooded about actually choosing the big things that can really cut emissions significantly and don't cost that much. It's the Willie Sutton rule of why do you rob banks? Because that's where the money is. You need to focus on the big carbon sources and the big things we can do. Hence my earlier comment about the concrete plant near my house, cement plant. Those are the kind of opportunities, and I think so are some long-distance transmission lines with solar that really are cost-effective ways to cut emissions.
All right, Holly, my follow-up for you. Sorry, forgive me, David. My follow-up for Holly is some people hope for a restoration of a world without carbon dioxide. Some people would be happy just with a world that is somewhat repaired. Where are you on that continuum?
I mean, I want to set up my daughter and her generation so that their children have the options to decide what that looks like, because restoration of the climate isn't something we're going to see in my lifetime or yours.
You're confident about that?
I mean, it's going to take a while to build up an infrastructure that would remove carbon at scale, and it will take many, many decades to, draw down greenhouse gas concentrations. So what can we do to equip, the future to take on a project like that if they want to? That's what I'm wondering about.
I'm a little well, put it this way. Not in my lifetime, I get, but I'm a lot older than you. And when you say not even in your lifetime, that gets me a little concerned. Really? Not even in your lifetime?
I mean, we could cut emissions to zero, but that won't restore the climate. Those are two different things, as David's op-ed discusses.
But Holly, if I can jump in, it might be possible to begin restoring. So I completely agree with you if the issue is restoring it all the way. But what would you say if the issue was, could we begin to get it cooler? Could we begin the process of heading back towards pre-industrial your lifetime? What do you think?
I think we can begin that process, and that begins with doing the research.
Okay, Marcus, I'm going to give you the last word. If you go to your website, the future looks pretty awesome. But I want to know how realistic it is. Is there really a future you see that is not all doom and gloom?
I certainly think this is a solvable problem if we're talking about climate or even ecological restoration, but I think we shouldn't kid ourselves about how difficult it's going to be. Maybe I'm somewhere between Holly and David. I think that I'd like to see GHG emissions, let's say, peak within my lifetime. I think that's achievable. But I think if you look at the current trajectory, something I say often is, listen, we like to debate about what our favorite climate intervention is. Everyone think of whatever your favorite solution is. In fact, let's take all the solutions you've ever heard discussed. The net effect of all that action is that greenhouse gases continue to go up every year. So that shows us that we have solutions in front of us. We have trade-offs to make, but we do have a long way to go.
Marcus Extavour, Holly Buck, David Keith, it's really good of all three of you to join us on TVO tonight and share your views. Good luck in your, big time good luck in your work to get us to where we need to go. And thank you for having the discussion with us this evening.
Thank you.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.